Okay, great. Hello again and welcome everyone. My name is Devati. I'm the executive editor of Current Conservation, and along with the Society for Conservation Biology, we are delighted to present to you this webinar on getting your conservation and research message across to the media and public. Here with us today is Christopher Joyce, and he will be talking to us about media ecosystems, how journalists work, what they are looking for, and how we can help them get things right and what to do if they don't. He'll also talk about clarifying your message and making it compelling and whatever else interests you media-wise. As I said, I'm Devati and I work with Current Conservation, and I will now hand over to Ed, our co-host for the evening, who will introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Devati. Yeah, I'm Ed Gallo, and I'm the Vice President of Education and Outreach at the Society for Conservation Biology. Just a few housekeeping notes before we proceed to our webinar. Please make sure to turn off your camera and microphone during the webinar. We are going to have a Q&A session at the end after Chris's presentation, so please prepare your questions accordingly. I encourage you to write them down as we go, and make sure that you also include comments. So what we are trying to do is to have a two-way conversation. Chris has been very emphatic about having an actual open conversation, a dialogue, two-way, straight conversation. So please don't be shy, get your questions prepared. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please contact Lee Manga. Her email is included up here on the slide, so please write that down. And if you have any issues technically, please reach out to her. In order to make this webinar available to a larger audience, this event is being recorded. All people who have registered will receive the link to the recording in due course. Thank you very much. Over to you, Deb.
You're muted, Deb.
Thank you. Happens in every Zoom meeting. Yeah, so this webinar is brought to you as part of the partnership between the Society for Conservation Biology and Current Conservation. It started in January 2021 with the goal of leveraging each other's capabilities to further advance biodiversity conservation around the world. And I'm just going to quickly introduce Current Conservation because, So Current Conservation Magazine is a quarterly print and online magazine. We are open access and not-for-profit. We work with scientists, researchers, and artists from all over the world to tell stories from the field of conservation. And I just wanted to quickly note that we do accept submissions year-round, and more details about that you'll find at the link below. The Society for Conservation Biology, which probably all of you on this call know, is the largest professional society dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. And with that, I'll hand over back to Ed to introduce Chris.
Thank you very much. It is finally my great pleasure to introduce you all to Christopher Joyce. For starters, Christopher Joyce knows how to tell an incredible story. For 28 years, he worked at NPR, seeking out stories from some of the world's most inaccessible places. NPR is the National Public Radio, an American privately and publicly funded nonprofit media organization headquartered in Washington, D.C. These stories can be heard all over NPR, from All Things Considered to Morning Edition. He's covered a wide range of scientific topics, from volcanoes and hurricanes to tagging giant bluefin tuna, climate change, and the artificial insemination of an African elephant. He was also an editor and correspondent for NPR's radio expeditions and has written 2 nonfiction books, one on forensics and human rights, and the other one on economic botany and ethnobotany. For the past 20+ years, Mr. Joyce has worked with the Compass organization as a trainer in seminars and workshops on science communication for scientists. And now he brings us this webinar pro bono as a way to pay back scientists for what has been a very rewarding career. Without any further ado, may I introduce you all to Christopher Joyce. Chris, the floor is all yours. Please take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for signing up for this. I think of all of you as my greatest friends and pals because I have had the most fun in my life being out with what I call muddy boots biologists, whether it's rainforests in Ecuador or mountains in Tibet, wetlands in Guatemala, all the time with conservation scientists, biologists, ecologists, wildlife managers, and it's always been the most fun. And so one of the reasons that I do talks like this and worked with Compass for 25 years is because I want to give back, because I have made a pretty decent living telling stories on the radio, writing a couple of books, working for New Scientist magazine in London for 10 years in the 80s. And it's scientists who make it possible. And so I think it's really important for me to continue to work with people in the sciences to help make my job easier and other journalists' job easier, but also to help you get your story across. I'm going to start with a few concepts. Having done these for many years with Compass, I know that a lot of people want to know, for example, how do we get our stories? Where do they come from? So a typical day at NPR might be, well, what's the news of the day? If it were yesterday or the day before, it might be the DART NASA project that knocked an asteroid off its course. I mean, it's news. It's big news. I just saw a fox run across my front yard. Now that's amazing. Anyway, that would be de rigueur. We'd have to cover that because that's the news of the day. That's what's big. Everybody's covering it. We've got to do that. We are a herd animal. Journalists are. Journals. We read journals all the time. They're the low-hanging fruit. We get a lot of our stories from journals. We're not always greatly happy about that because we like to be first, and we can't because the journals come out en masse and are sent to all the journals I compete with. But that's how science works. And so we cover journal stories every week. We get press releases from government agencies, NGOs, activists, corporate interests, universities. I can't say we get a lot of stories from press releases, but we do find out who's doing what. It keeps us apprised of who's doing the research that we might be interested in. If there's a story of the day that we need expertise in, if we kept our press releases, we know who's doing what and we can call and know where to go. And it's really great for people who are in institutions to work with your press office, if you've got one, to help you get across your message and to know what's a story and what's not a story. They do have a pretty good concept of that. Do we get stories directly from you? Yes, we do. We love to hear from scientists directly, emails, Twitter, whatever. They're not always stories. Often, if you're not in the storytelling business, you might think it's a story. It's not. It's a topic. It's something of interest, but there's no. What we look for as journalists is a peg, something that makes it new, something that makes today different. We know something today we didn't know yesterday. And do remember, you're competing with the journals and the big institutions and the news of the day. But please, reach out to us, because even if what you think is a story isn't, we now know you, we know what you're doing. And of course, we're always looking for people to comment on a paper in Science, for example. Well, I'll have a list of people I want to call because I have to do my own sort of peer review. And it's great to work with scientists and on background often, and to know what's going on. So what makes a good story? Is it new? Is it truly new? Did you find a new species? Okay, that's totally new. Or find a species you thought was endangered, or excuse me, it was extinct. Is it counterintuitive? Grazing cattle in tropical dry forests in Costa Rica is a bad thing, but Dan Jansen finally discovered that no, it's good, because you need hoofed animals to break up the Guanacaste seeds. It's just remembering something that I did years ago, but we used to think this, and now we think that. That's always a good story. Anytime there's a mystery, and science is all about solving mysteries, that helps make a good story. A process story. How is science done? I spent a week in Argentina with Dee Boersma at the University of Washington. Ed, you may know Dee. Working on penguins and how climate change affects the feeding habits and the diets of Magellantic penguins. So, it may not be all that new. It may not even be published, but it's how science is done and it's adventure. There are gee whiz stories that are just so cool that you can't overlook them. I remember doing one that got lots of attention because it was about a spider that bites, it's a wasp that stings a spider and injects its larva into the spider, but it doesn't kill it. And the spider then is reprogrammed to weave a web that's crappy, so that when the spider dies and the wasp's offspring come out of the spider, they don't get caught in the web. I mean, it's just so cool. And people in conservation biology are, you're in possession of millions of things that are just plain cool. So I should also mention the fact that in conservation biology and ecology, you've got in terms compared to chemists or physicists, you're confronted with something that is extremely newsworthy every day, and that's climate change. And the fact is, you're not observational so much anymore as watching, you're acting. I mean, I did a story with Clint Mulfeld from a U.S. Geological Survey. He's at Glacier in Montana, about a very provocative act. It was taking bull trout from their native habitat and moving them on his back in a backpack full of water up to a higher elevation lake in order to give them a better chance to survive and against not only warmer waters at lower elevation, but also invasive or warmer water species that were encroaching. There's constantly stuff going on having to do with dealing with climate change, and not only observing it, but actually acting on it, doing something about it. Something that fascinates me is climate refugia. What are we going to do about finding places for organisms that are in dire trouble? So you've got that. So how do you get your story across? Well, it's helpful. How do I share my screen? Okay. I'm not quite sure how to do that.
That's only if you have slides that you'd like to share.
There should be a ribbon at the bottom.
Oh yeah, okay.
That says share, and then you just wanna pull that one off.
Well, no, that doesn't seem to be doing anything.
Sorry, Chris, do you see a ribbon if you hover your mouse towards the bottom of the screen?
Yeah, but I'm coming up with a window that's not offering me anything that I can see is useful.
Okay, if you click on share screen, you are a co-host. Okay. Yeah, so you click on it. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so where was I? Okay, yeah. So what's a story? A story is, in the classic sense, a story is something that's a series of events that move through time. And you have a main character, and the character faces a challenge, obstacles along the way, and finally, in the end, they come up with a discovery, or not a discovery, but that, in a sense, still a conclusion to it. I'm going to play a bit of an interview, an outtake from an interview that I did with a young postdoc at the University of Maryland who went to Florida to study birds and got roped into capturing an alligator with a bunch of other biologists she didn't even know, and noticed as she was doing so these little pits in the face of the alligator, and she didn't know what the pits were, and nobody else did what they did, and it fascinated her, and she ended up being published on the cover on her first scientific article in Nature magazine. So this is part of the interview, and I just want you to listen to the way that she tells this.
I'm curious as to how this all came about to you, because you said you were studying birds.
Yes.
But what were you doing messing around with gators?
And this is actually a fun story because it was my first day out in the field, and we went out in the field and they were collecting gators for blood samples and a variety of other things. And we're coming back and there was this big gator on the back of this truck, and I was sitting on it.
This is your first time?
This is my first time. So I was sitting on top of it, and there are other people around, you know, we're all trying to keep the gator down and going back to the lab with this large animal. He must have been maybe 7-8 feet. He was, you know, he was a decent size to me, at least.
Bigger than you.
Bigger than me. Maybe a little bit bigger than me. And you know, we're going back, and it was very exciting. Somebody was driving way too fast on that road, I could tell you that. And then I was, you know, it's amazing when you start paying attention to the animal you're working with, and you're just looking at it and, you know, seeing what it looks like and morphology. And I looked at its face and I thought, gee, you know, what are these little dots all over the place? And so I came back to the lab and I did a big literature search, and I looked to see if anybody had studied them. What, you know, what is this? You know, just out of plain scientific curiosity.
Okay, so I love that, and we used a lot of that in the article. You may notice that we didn't talk about the science. The pits, by the way, are conduits for nerve endings, and when an alligator sits in the water with its face half in and half out of the water, the pits line up with the surface of the water so that if something falls in the water, like a bird, it creates waves, and that's how the gator senses it, part of its predatory behavior. But you see, she told a story, and it had emotion, it had serendipity. I love that. And she ended up with this wonderful summary. You know, I just did this out of plain scientific curiosity, which tells the listener a lot. It's not data. It tells you about scientists and how they work and what motivates them. And, you know, that is what people connect with. They don't connect with statistics. They don't care about standard deviations. They care about, well, who are these people doing this work and why do they do it? And which is, you know, one of the reasons that people like me will interview you and say, well, wait a minute, why did you start to do this in the first place? And what motivated you? And was that a surprise? And what happened next? The scientific data we can deal with from the paper or further in the interview. But what we're going for also is the context, the fuller story. Let's talk a bit about language. Jargon is your enemy. Verbs are your friend. Active verbs. Scientists like to use the passive voice a lot. Say, an experiment was performed. Don't say that. Say, we did an experiment. It sounds simple and stupid, but this kind of language is powerful. You know, don't use phony formality. You know, it's not an individual, it's a person. You know, I did an interview with Ove Goldberg, who's a marine biologist in Australia. And he said, I asked, you know, how did they describe the Great Barrier Reef? And he said, well, I don't call it a biological system, but it's an aquatic rainforest. Now there's an image. If you can make images in people's head, that's better. He says it plants and animals stay in balance like a plate spinning on a stick. So analogy, metaphor is simply something you use that people know to describe something they don't know. And they're great. Avoid fuzzy language. Language is not jargon, but it's, people think they know what it means, but they often don't. And then that causes confusion. Like for sustainability, I mean, there's one that people think they know, but maybe they don't. Or I've heard, there is a phrase from a paper I read, quote, conservation stewardship practices involve multiple layers of the ecosystem in balanced relationships. I mean, there's no jargon in there, but I have to read that twice to figure it out. And you don't want to do that with people. So when you're talking to journalists or the public at large, whatever you can do to avoid losing them, because if they get confused and they get bored, they're going to tune out. I'm going to play one more quick audio about how journalists sometimes do this. This is an example of an NPR journalist. Let's see. Who was doing a story about West Nile virus, and the story was going around that zoos might be a reservoir for infection, and people were scared to go to the zoo, and they were scared about zoos affecting, you know, the neighborhoods. And so John went to interview a biologist at a zoo who, insisted that it was not a problem, but he was having trouble getting plain language. And John took matters in his own hand, not in a way I necessarily recommend, but you'll see how it worked.
The important statement that we want people to the important statement that we want people to understand is that zoos are part of the community in which they exist, and that community either has risk or does not have risk, and there's no difference within the zoo boundaries than with outside the zoo boundaries. So we actually are.
You didn't say that right. The community, just do that again. That was great, though. I mean, no. Here, look. I told you this already, but I'm at the end of the bar. I'm really drunk. I want you to make this point. I want you to hold my interest, but I am a real dumb shit, and I'm going to fall over and get a hematoma if you don't give this to me. So, and I'm convinced that I'm going to die if I go to the zoo. Okay, if I go to the zoo, I'm going to die, buddy. I don't care who you are. So you tell me. You got 10 seconds to tell me why I don't have to worry about the zoos.
Zoos are not any different than the surrounding area in which they exist. There's no reason to believe that coming inside a zoo wall presents a greater risk than being outside the zoo walls. They're part of the community in which they exist. The animals here are just as susceptible as the people, and it's a citywide or a region-wide thing, not a specific hotspot.
How do you know that?
We know that because we test our animals a lot. We test for mosquitoes. We look for mosquitoes. We actually do more surveillance inside the zoo than the cities do or the counties do outside the zoo. So we actually know our risk much more than say another part of the city.
And it's low.
And it's very low. Yeah. Nice.
See, I'm helping you. It's media training.
That's right. That's right.
It's not a hot spot. We test our animals even more than people outside the zoo test their animals, and it's not a problem. So he finally nailed it. John went a little far, perhaps, but in a sense, that's what a lot of journalists are thinking, is that they just they want the bottom line. It's not like the scientific paper where the methods are at the top and the bottom line is at the bottom. You start with what's important, what's the bottom line, and then cascading down from there, the details, the context, the methodology, the statistics, why we know that this is correct, that sort of thing. And that's, it's not just journalists. I mean, that tends to be the way people learn things. Played the alligator tape. I mean, there are techniques that you can use to help yourself in preparing for an interview or preparing for a talk at a school or preparing for a presentation outside of, I'm not talking about scientific presentations, because we all have jargon, we all have argot, and we all talk to our peers in a special way. But when you're not talking to your peers, Compass puts forward something called a message box. It's basically organizing your thoughts into what's the issue, what's the problem, what are the solutions, what's the benefit, and so what. So what's always the question that the journalists are going to be getting at. Nice research you're doing, but so what? But if you can organize your thoughts along those lines, and brevity is golden, and practice it, then you'll be able to get your message across in a much more succinct way, in a powerful way. Practice it, be available for follow-up always with journalists. If you're talking with a journalist or somebody else for that matter, don't hesitate to say, are you following me, or in a polite way. Just if they get that glazed look, you might realize they're losing it. And if they're not understanding it, they're going to get it wrong. And you don't want them to get it wrong. Also remember that in an interview, it's a two-way conversation. You're not defenseless, hit with a barrage of questions, and you must answer each one dutifully and wait for the next one. I mean, you can it's two ways. It's like a tennis match, you know, you're whacking the ball back and you can say, well, wait a minute, that's a good question, but I think we need to cover something else instead. I mean, you can help take charge of a conversation. It's always good at the end of an interview to say, did you understand everything? Did you get everything that you needed? There's something we should go over again. Because the clearer you are, the less likely the journalist is going to make a mistake. One other thing is that energy is infectious. And I think you heard in the both of those outtakes from NPR interviews, the scientists had quite a lot of emotion or energy or vigor in the way they were talking. I mean, sometimes people think, oh, scientists are so dull because they just sort of, there's no intonation. They're just trying to be unemotional. And that may be, you know, I think something characteristic of the scientific enterprise, which is we don't have emotions. And of course, that's nonsense, especially in your field, because so much joy in conservation and wildlife ecology. And so let that come through, because certainly in audio and in television, that really gets listeners and viewers' attention. If you feel like, well, this person loves what they're doing and they really have a strong feelings about it, that's helpful. So how are we doing on time?
If you could start wrapping it up, we could get started with the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah, well, there's one thing I thought it would take about a minute. Just to give you an example, these aren't scientists, but I think you get the message here. This is Vladimir Putin on the day, making a speech on the day that he said he was going to enlist 300,000 new soldiers. The issue concerns the necessary imperative measures to protect the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Russia and support the desire and will of our compatriots to choose their future independently, and the aggressive policy of some Western elites who are doing their utmost to preserve their domination, and with this aim in view are trying to block and suppress any sovereign and independent development centers in order to continue to aggressively force their will and pseudo values on other countries and nations. That's one sentence, okay? Now here is Volodymyr Zelensky the week before addressing the Grammy Awards. Notice, not necessarily the content, but the structure, the sentences, declarative sentences, visual imagery. Our children draw swooping rockets, not shooting stars. Over 400 children have been injured and 153 children died, and we'll never see them drawing. Our parents are happy to wake up in the morning in bomb shelters, but alive. Our loved ones don't know if we will be together again. The war doesn't let us choose who survives and who stays in eternal silence. Our musicians wear body armor instead of tuxedos. They sing to the wounded in hospitals, even to those who can't hear them. But the music will break through anyway. We defend our freedom to live, to love, to sound. Our land, we are fighting. On our land, we are fighting Russia, which brings horrible silence with its bombs, the dead silence. Fill the silence with your music. Fill it today. Tell our story. Tell the truth about this war. So, besides the fact that one side's evil and one side's not, the structure there, the simple sentences, the powerful images, the visual imagery, the metaphor. This is an example of effective communication. And you can do so much with the way you choose words. So let's do Q&A.
Right. Thank you so much, Chris, for this amazing webinar. It has been really eye-opening. You have provided us all with so many nuggets and so much food for thought in our daily job as scientists, and how we can make our science more impactful. To all attendees, we will now transition to our Q&A session. For this, we would appreciate very much if you could write down your questions in the chat box as we go. We will call the attendees in order, and we'll ask the attendees to unmute themselves and turn their camera on. Then they can proceed to read their questions out loud. Alternatively, if attendees do not feel comfortable asking the questions directly to Chris, we will read them out for you. We hope this session will be an open two-way conversation to ensure attendees make the most of having this invaluable time with Chris. So please, let's make the most of this Q&A session, and let's check if we have any questions. Okay, so we have here one request, but I think that's for later. Can you share these exemplified speeches? Okay, great. So I have one question for Chris, just to get the ball rolling. Meanwhile, we get more questions coming through. So I guess as scientists, we like to be all the time, I mean, accurate, or as accurate as possible, you know, and true to our work. And I know, as you were mentioning, the need to, you know, get rid of jargon, the need of simplify, the need of bringing storytelling and emotion, sometimes means that, you know, if you pick, or if a journalist picks an article from a scientific journal, some of those, you know, are gonna be translated, right? The information from the statistics, from the analysis, into probably a little bit of the emotions, a little bit of not having so much jargon. And the question is, how can we make sure that we have access to the story just before it actually, you know, gets published?
You can't.
We can't. Okay.
No. I mean, it's journalistic ethics. First of all, you have a free press, an independent press can't be independent. If I were a political reporter and I were covering a story involving Joe Manchin and you know, AOC and others on climate, and I gave my story to Joe Manchin and AOC and you know, various politicians before I published it, would you really read it? Would you believe it? Because that just eliminates the possibility of being independent, because of course those people will hammer away at you to change your story. But more practically speaking, let's say I'm doing a story and I've got 4 scientists, and you know, I would have to show it to each one of them to be fair. And each one of them is, well, your first one's going to say, well, I know I said that because it's on tape, but my department head is probably going to not like the way I put those words, so I want to redo it. I want to say it a different way. I want to tone it down, which immediately makes it, you know, make it sound like probably more boring. And then the second scientist says, oh, I see you've got so-and-so in here. Well, I hate them, and their research is shit. And so you've got to take them out or you lose me. And then the third scientist you want to reach, oh, excuse me, I'm in Alaska on a 2-week, I'm not reachable. I'm 2 weeks in the bush in Alaska. You get back to me in 2 weeks. So that's what you run into. So you've got the ethical problem and you've got the practical problem. The best way to, you know, to deal with the media when they're doing this, when they're interviewing you, is when they're doing the interview, be attuned to whether they think that they've got it right. Say, do you want me to go over that again? Do you fully understand it? Say to the journalist, get back to me anytime. When you're putting together the story, if you want to go over stuff, if you don't understand something, get back to me, please. And I'll be glad to straighten it out. The more you can help, the less likely they'll make a mistake. And as I said before, also, if you are clear in the beginning to the journalists are less likely to make a mistake. Will it happen? Yes, it's going to happen sometimes. Get on the publication right away, call them up, email them and say, you made a mistake, you need to correct it. One final thought on that is also think about the quality of the mistake, the depth of it. You know, did they misspell something or give the wrong name of the department head, or the, you know, instead of institution, you said institute? Or because some errors are minor, they may seem major to you, but they're minor. Most people, listeners, take away a basic idea from a story. They don't remember the names of people, they don't remember the names of institutions. They just remember, oh, that story about that spider that gets inoculated by a wasp and it turns the wasp's web crazy. That is so cool. That's what they take away. And so, be careful. I mean, I know scientists are, and rightfully so, concerned about each item being absolutely accurate, because that's the way journals work. the media is a little different, and as long as the main idea gets across, you know, that's 90% of a win.
Thank you very much, Chris. I guess, yeah, we are a little bit overly concerned for details that at the end of the day probably do not matter as much in the public opinion. So let's transition then to a question from the floor. So we have a question from Flavia Franchini. So Flavia, if you would like to unmute yourself and turn your camera on to ask the question, or just I'm happy to ask the question on your behalf. So if Flavia doesn't turn her camera on, I'll take probably that we'll ask the question on her behalf. So as scientists, we are trained to be careful with what we say, as hardly ever things are true or false. That's why we tend to say that the data shows something, how to be accurate, and not to say that something is a fact, but at the same time not to lose interest.
Well, there are ways to say that, and I don't know that I've ever asked anybody, a scientist, to say that's absolutely fact 100% true. I mean, you know, it's certainly fine to say this is what the data or interpretation of the data leads us to believe. This is what we think is happening from the data. And I think that's a sufficient caveat that the public understands. I never felt the need to say to listeners, no, this is absolutely true, that because, you know, science is linear the way spaghetti is. One day you think coffee's or red wine is good for you. The next day, maybe red wine is not so good for you. I mean, science does change. And so you need to protect yourselves. And I think that most people in the public understand that you can say, so far, this is what the data lead us to conclude. And we're like, pretty sure, you know, if you're talking about a p-value, don't say p-value, but you say, look, we're pretty sure that this is what's happening. It could be something else, but I think you can do that.
I think a follow-up question from Flavia was also, is there any sort of training you know of that can help with objectivity, make things interesting and clear, but still keep the validity?
Well, I wouldn't say you necessarily need training. Just let yourself be yourself, rather than oh, wait a minute, I'm going to put on my scientist screen here, my scientist hat, and I'm going to lose all emotion, and I'm going to talk in language that is my language, passive tense. I'm going to throw a bunch of numbers at you. Once you remember that the rest of the world that's not, or who are not scientists, don't get it. They don't understand it. And frankly, I think a lot of people in the public, when a scientist can't get across a fairly simple idea, they're not only confused, they're resentful. I mean, remember, come on, I remember high school, the smartest kids in my class were the kids who made A's in physics and chemistry. And they went on to be scientists. And so, I mean, you guys got PhDs, you're smart. So why is it that a smart person can't speak plain English? And so people I think they get resentful.
And Tanya had a question, which was, do you have any additional suggestions specifically for topics that are against popular opinion?
For what's against popular opinion?
For topics that are against popular opinion?
Well, nuclear power, GMOs. I mean, I don't know that they're against popular opinion. It depends. I mean, popular opinion is never 100% one direction or the other. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the public, climate change, you know, historically, where the public has been misinformed or badly informed or purposely misled. And so, you know, what I often tell environmental journalists, for example, the Society of Environmental Journalism, is follow the data, follow the scientists, and put aside the activists. So they're secondary, and even the NGOs, they have an agenda. Everybody has an agenda. But in my experience, scientists have the least amount of agenda, except their agenda being good science. And so go with people with the least powerful agenda to get, you know, objective data and objective opinions on science.
Ross, I think you are muted.
Oh, sorry, again. Angela, would you like to ask the next question yourself? Or would you prefer us to read it out?
Go ahead and ask it. Sorry. Did you want me to ask it, or do you want to go ahead and ask?
You can go ahead.
Okay, let me just pull this up again. The question was just kind of getting that entry and getting in touch with journalists. What's the best way to do this?
There's several ways. If your institution has a press office, you know, those people, that's their job, is to understand your research and get it out to journalists. And that's useful and helpful because they should know where to go and what to do. On your own, you can follow people on Twitter or just, you know, read the publications. I don't know where you're from and what you read, but you know, if you're reading the Washington Post, the New York Times, Slate, Vox, Huffington Post, whatever, and you come across journalists you think are good, if you can find out how to reach them, and just, you know, you can reach them directly. Chances are they may not respond to you, or if they do, they may say, well, thank you, that's a nice idea, but it's not really a story. But at least you're on the radar. And it's also very useful, I think, for scientific communication in general, whether or not you and your research gets into the news. If you can help journalists do a better job, because everybody profits from that. I have, you know, a huge list of scientists, literally thousands, I think now, whom I've met over 40 years. And, you know, if I see a paper coming out in a journal, and I don't care if it's peer reviewed, yeah, I mean, in the sense, yes, peer review is great. It's an extra layer of validity. But I may say, well, I still want to talk to my people. And I'll talk to people, and I may quote them or may not quote them. But I say, look, would you comment? Would tell me, is this paper garbage? Is it good? Is it got problems? If it does have problems, should I go back to the author and double check this? If you can be part of that sort of journalist cloud, the peer review cloud, that helps everybody, I think.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So you might have sort of answered this already, but how do you make scientific data easily accepted by other people and readers? By which they mean, how do you make this data interesting for everyone, not just for people with a focus on conservation?
There are two things come to mind. Interesting question. Accepted or understandable? Accepted is one thing. I mean, data can be, or the interpretation data can be understandable, but not accepted for political reasons, which we see with climate change all the time. I mean, even when the data or the results or the hypotheses or the theories that we come to are patently crystal clear, some people will just reject them because it's a political or social or even religious problem. Again, it's making it, excuse the term, dumbing. It's not dumbing down. I mean, I don't think there's any concept that's too complicated for people to understand. I mean, even string theory, maybe. It's language that's too complicated. So if you can describe your research in a way that people understand it, using plain English, using analogy, using similes, using metaphor, using visual images in a powerful way, and get to the bottom line, say why it matters, the so what question, how it makes life different. And believe me, I don't care how minuscule your little corner of research is. I mean, I know what it's like to be, a postdoc and doing the basic junk work at the lab bench, looking down the barrel of a microscope for months and months. Okay, and you say, how could this possibly mean anything to anybody? Well, if you think of it as a brick in a mighty edifice, and what the little brick that you're working on is part of something that's really important, and could be like sequestration of carbon. I spend my days looking at the microorganisms in a square meter of a wetland, and how could that be interesting to anybody? Well, if you cast it in the larger picture of, do you know how important peat is in sequestering carbon and how much it can contribute to slowing climate change? Your research can become more interesting to people.
Thanks, Chris. We next have a question from Joseph, who asks how early career researchers can get their message out without having a big public profile.
Well, get tenure. Well, I would say the same way that you might do, if you were further along, which is to reach out, pay attention to who's writing about science in the popular media, and find publications and people you think are good, and see if you can reach out to them. And you can be aggressive with your institution and say, look, I think I'm doing really interesting work here, and so if you got any ideas on how to go about getting that published and getting that publicized, I suppose you run afoul of annoying your department head or your boss, because I mean, who's this? What's this person doing? They're not supposed to be talking to the media. I've had that. I've actually had that happen, but not too often. And being active on Twitter, for example, I mean, I followed Twitter a lot, especially in the early days of Twitter, when not too many journalists were looking at it. I would follow the paleontology community. I would follow the conservation community, and I would see what they're doing. And if I saw something interesting, that's where you pick up gossip about what's going on in the field. And I would then reach out to that person and say, look, can we talk about this? This is interesting. It's a way to get scoops, and journalists love scoops. They love being the only person to have that story.
The next question might have a lot to unpack here, so I'm going to read it out really slowly. How do we separate ourselves from the activists who tend to be very sensational and often use false or misleading information that invokes strong emotions, which then attracts journalists and the public?
Excellent question, and it's a real dilemma. I think, as I alluded to earlier, it hasn't always made me popular with the Society for Environmental Journalists, but I think there are a lot of journalists who tend to be seduced by that. They are seduced by the activists. In some cases, they're the same people they go out having beers with or go kayaking with. Sometimes the relationship's a little too cozy. Activists are, and I'm thinking mostly here of NGOs, many of whom do great work. I mean, I'm not dissing all of them, but some are I can think of 2 or 3 that tend to be more politically driven. And I mean, when you say disassociate from them, I mean, you can remind people that you work for an academic institution or an organization that doesn't have a particular political point of view, that you're working on research that's aimed at the peer-reviewed literature, not a press release coming out of Friends of the Earth, so that it's clear to the journalist that you're in the scientific mainstream and not in that sort of that world that attaches itself to the scientific mainstream that's a more politicized. And again, look, I mean, environmental groups have done great things and they do good research. But I mean, one alarm bell that always goes off with me when I get approached by an environmental group is, well, if you're coming up with some sort of scientific conclusion, where have you published it? And if they haven't even tried to put it in a peer-reviewed journal, I'm going to say, look, I may or may not follow up with this, but I need an extra layer of skepticism here if it hasn't gone through peer review.
Great. We're nearly running out of time, Chris. There are a few more questions, but we might have to start wrapping up.
Okay. So bottom line here, and that's the bottom line is the term that we're always going to be asking you, in fact. So, you know, professor, doctor, you know, what's the bottom line here? And that's the way that journalists work, because we are the proxies for the public. And if we're doing our job right, we are putting ourselves in the position of, you know, the regular person on the street and in trying to determine what they're interested in and how to get it across to them. And if you think of it as a collaboration, because most science journalists are in this because they like science. I started out as a political reporter covering Washington, D.C., the government, covered Congress, covered the Supreme Court, the agencies. And after several years, I just ran screaming from Washington. I couldn't stand it, pulling my hair out because they're all liars. Well, okay, maybe they're not all liars, but frankly, it's not an enterprise that's aimed at getting at the truth. I wanted to find an enterprise where people are trying to get at the truth. And if there's one that falls in that category, clearly and directly, it's the scientific community. That's when I got into the science writing. And so I think you'll find that most journalists, there are a few with agendas that will approach you with, you know, preconceived notions. Feel free not to talk to them. Do some research on them if they call you before you talk to them. But by and large, they love science and they want to get across what you're doing. And so think of it as a collaboration where you have much more control than you think you do. You can shape any conversation by thinking of it as a conversation where I'm going to tell this person what they need to know in addition to the questions they think they want to ask. Because a lot of journalists approach interviews, they don't know what's going on. They have a basic idea. But, you know, I may be covering, I mean, I can't cover and know everything about astronomy to zoology, just, you know, no matter how I'm trained. And so be active and also, you know, be clear, forget the jargon, be energetic, and kind of keep up the good work, because God knows the public needs to know more about science.
This has been wonderful, Chris. Thank you very much. So this concludes our webinar, How to Get Your Conservation and Research Message Across the Media and the Public, brought to you by Current Conservation Magazine and the Society for Conservation Biology. We would like to thank Chris once again for sharing his lifetime of expertise, sharing all his knowledge and all of his wonderful stories. I wish we had more time, but unfortunately we are running out. You can all follow Chris on Twitter, and I'm going to be including his Twitter handle on the chat box. So please feel free to join him on the conversation online. And as mentioned at the opening, this webinar will be made available through social media in the coming days, so it can reach an even wider audience. So please feel free to share widely.
Thank you for listening, everybody. Appreciate it. Really do.
Thank you, Chris.
Dev, over to you.
And actually, this is a little bit of a plug. When Joseph asked how can early career researchers get the message of their research out, I was just thinking, oh my God, right, for current conservation. And we do actually encourage early career researchers to write for us, and just go to our website, currentconservation.org, to find out more about our submission process. And a lot of the things that we look for are exactly the things that Chris talked about today as well, which you'll see in the submissions page. And it has been such a fantastic evening for me, and morning for you, Chris and Ed, and many others. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for attending the webinar, everyone. We hope it has provided all you with new tools and perspectives to continue advancing the science and practice of conserving biodiversity on Earth. So goodbye for now. Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.